All right, so we are going to be talking about the history and approaches of psychology right now. This is the first lesson of the class. Psychology wasn't always a scientific study, right? It started off as a little branch of philosophy because we didn't really have any scientific ways of studying us, our brains, our consciousness, or anything, right? Um, and one of the things that we did try to use to try to explain our personalities, our behaviors, our motivations, and all that was phrenology, which was basically we're studying the bumps on people's head, and we thought that that could tell us how intelligent they were, what their character was, what their motivations were. Of course, we pretty much know that this is nonsense now, but this was taken seriously up until like the 1940s when the Nazis were around. They were big believers in phrenology, and they used it to sort of scapegoat the Jews. Um, we have philosophers like Aristotle, Socrates, and Plato, John Locke, all contemplating on what the human mind is. Is it attached to the brain? Is it outside the brain? Uh, they knew that as we gained more experience, we got smarter and smarter. Uh, but John Locke had this idea that we were born a blank slate, a completely uh, blank book, waiting on somebody, the world also, to start writing their experiences, programming their experiences into us, and we would then create this model of how we perceive the world and how we're going to interact with it, right? So Locke believed that the mind was a tabula rasa, which is a blank slate. Um, then we also have Wilhelm Wundt, who happens to be the father of, psychology. Why? Because he developed the world's first psychological laboratory back in 1879 in Leipzig, Germany, right? And of course, because it's a laboratory, what do we do in laboratories? We experiment, right? So experimental psychology was born then and there. Now, Wundt, along with one of his students, Edward Titchener, it was mainly Edward Titchener that developed this structuralism, but of course it was with the help of his mentor, Wundt. What does structuralism say? Well, structuralism says that structures of our brain, like the uh, amygdala, like the somatosensory cortex strip, these different structures of the brain, they wanted to study them. They wanted to know how they would work together to form our mental processes, right? But again, they didn't have machines so they could study the brain directly back then, or even indirectly. So how were they going to study the brain? They were going to study the brain through introspection. What is introspection? We look in upon ourselves, right? We try to think about ourselves, how we can improve ourselves. Is there something that we need to do more of? Is there something we need to do less of? Uh, Something that will make us a better person. What's the big problem with this? Well, we're not really honest with ourselves a lot of the times. So we might not be dealing with the full picture because we want to keep our minds, our thoughts out of that situation, right? So introspection is good. It gets easier as you get older, but especially when you're young, right? You're still a developing person. You don't know who you are, what you want to do. So it's going to be harder for you to try to use introspection to help yourself become a better person when you're not exactly sure what you're going to grow up to be. Then we have William James. He is considered to be the father of psychology in the United States. Why? He wrote the first textbook used in our studies, right? The Principles of Psychology. He authored that. That was the first official psychology textbook, right? What was he focused on? Well, he wasn't a structuralist. He didn't care about all the different structures of the brain. Well, he did care, right? But he wanted to study, he wanted to emphasize what the functions of those structures were, not exactly where they're placed in the brain, or he wants to know what they're doing and how they all work together to make us who we are, right? So think of yourself, if you're a functionalist, right, and you're going to a car, you're going to flip on the blinkers to see what happens, you're going to turn on the lights to see what happens, you're going to mess with the radio, you're going to rev the engine, you're going to pop open the hood, the trunk, the doors, the windows, you're going to do everything because you want to see how all of these things work. And then you can see how they harmonize and how you will then drive the car, right? Uh, but we can't just talk about uh, these people, right? We have the, and of course, the what happened after we developed the first psychological laboratory in Leipzig, Germany. We have to talk about some of these are the famous students of psychology and what they accomplished. Right, Mary Calkins here was one of William James' students. William James actually accepted her into his graduate seminar in Harvard, something no other person probably would have done. Or what happened when she entered his graduate seminar? Well, all the men that had signed up for the seminar dropped out because they did not want to take classes with a woman. But Mary Calkin, she stuck in, she hung in there. She took classes with William James, and she earned a degree from Harvard. But Harvard did not want to give her her degree because she was a woman. They did offer her to give her a degree from Radcliffe College. She declined it. She didn't want it. She wants it from Harvard, which is where she earned it from, right? But she did go on to become the first female president of the American Psychological Association. And of course, we have other women we can thank, right? Like Dorothea Dix. What did she do? Well, she helped reform the inhumane treatment that people were receiving in mental asylums, right? Uh, Nowadays, you can go, they treat the people in these institutions with dignity. That wasn't true before. It was a true horror scene if you would walk inside these asylums, guys. But we can thank Dorothea Dix for getting everybody in those institutions to treat the patients with care and dignity. Then we have G. Stanley Hall. He was the first person to graduate with a PhD in psychology. So, doctorate, right? He got a doctorate in psychology. And he was also the first to pioneer child psychology. Before then, nobody had thought to study children and their development. We can thank G. Stanley Hall for that. Then I already mentioned Edward Titchener before. He was Wundt's student. Titchener was the one that developed structuralism as an approach to psychology. So we can thank him for that, right? Now, after that psychology lab was established in Leipzig, Germany, it didn't take long for us to develop our own psychological laboratories in the United States. And of course, even Canada got in it. The University of Toronto established their psychological laboratory in 1890. So, when we want to talk about psychology, most of us accept that it isn't only one thing that's going to have an influence on us and our behavior, our psychological state, so on and so forth. We're going to have at least three different influences on us. How the three things that are going to influence our behavior and how we think and how we act, right? The first are the biological influences, right? How is our biology dictating our behavior? We all agree that men and women are different. So, um, how do our biological differences cause us to act differently, cause us to think differently? Does that happen? Yes or no? Right? We want to know how the hormones that are coursing through our body And of course, we all know what happens around puberty, right? You get flooded with these hormones and it makes us crazy for a little bit, right? We want to look at all of these biological influences and see what kind of effect they have on us, right? But we also have psychological influences that we have to worry about. Did we learn any fears from our parents, from our mother, from our father, right? Maybe you were playing happily in the living room one day when your mother freaked out and jumped on top of the sofa and drug you along with her. She ripped you from your little game. That might have scared the heck out of you too. So from then on, you learn to be afraid of mice just like your mother is, right? So these are just some of the psychological examples of psychological influences that have on our mental processes as well, right? Don't forget our sociocultural influences. Right about now, you guys might be more interested on what your friends have to say about something than your parents, right? That wasn't true when you were smaller, but now that you're growing up, you're becoming your own person. You want to rely less on your parents because you want to be your own person. So you go to your friends and ask them for advice, right? So peer pressure, that's a real thing, right? Of course, you guys are going to act differently around your friends than you will around teachers, than you will around your parents, than you will around your grandparents, right? All of these, we're going to act and interact with these groups differently. Now we're going to talk about the 7 approaches to psychology, right? Now, please pay attention to these because your homework assignment is going to be based off of these, right? So, the first approach to psychology is the behavioral approach, right? How uh, behavioral approach, guys, the psychologists, the researchers, whatever you want to consider them, are just going to focus on your behavior. What are you doing? What are you not doing? What they're not going to concern themselves with is your thought processes, right? They're not going to concern themselves with anything that's going on inside you. Maybe you chugged that gallon of water down because you were extremely thirsty. The behavioral psychologists are not going to care about the fact that you were thirsty. They're just going to see that you drank that water and they're going to wonder why you behaved why you drank it like that. Maybe you saw somebody drink it like that, right? That's what they're going to be thinking about. They're not going to be worried about what's going on inside your mind and your thought processes, which, of course, I believe is one of the major flaws of the behavioral approach. Um, because our mind, our brain, our thoughts direct our behavior most of the time, right? So the assumption here of the behavioral approach is that we're going to learn by interacting with our environment. That's our family, our friends, our teachers. We're going to learn by watching them and by doing what they do. Uh, John Watson and B.F. Skinner's are the original OGs, or the OGs of the behavioral approach. We will talk more about these individuals a lot more in other units, right? And these guys believed that we learn through modeling. In other words, I do something, then you do it. You watch me do it, then you do it. Imitation is, you see your dad uh, cleaning the car, right? He doesn't have you out there with him to help him, but you're just around the area playing, and you see him cleaning the car. And that is how you are going to learn to clean your car as well, by imitating your dad. Now, the biological approach places the emphasis on biology, right? Our brain, our nervous system. How are all these things working together? Our endocrine system, right? Our digestive system. How are all these things going to interact and affect our behavior? Of course, the brain is part of our biological systems, right? And the brain is where our mental processes originate. So we can't study biology without studying the brain. And that's where most of the focus is, right? But we're also going to study hormones and what effect they have on us, our bodies, our behavior, as well as genes. We will talk more about genes in other units. We will definitely talk about it when we get to personality as well. Now, the cognitive approach is all about how we think, because that's what cognitive means, right? It's, it involves our thinking processes. How are we going to process what we see? Are we going to determine if that's important enough for us to remember? If so, we need to store that information, but that information needs to be readily available so we can retrieve that information and use it whenever we need it. I know I'm not the only one that hates this, right? I know the answer. It's at the tip of my tongue. It's the tip of my tongue. But for some reason, you can't get it out of your mind, right? That is a retrieval failure. And the key assumption in the cognitive approach is we're going to base our opinions of the world and the people around us, the society around us, on how we perceive the world, right? Uh, Remember, perception all happens in the brain. So again, the focus of this approach is on the mind again. But this time we're worried about how do we process information? How do we store our thoughts? How do we store our memories? And then how do we retrieve them? But most importantly, how do we solve our problems, right? That is one thing that separates us from other animals. There is more than one way to skin a cat. And I hope you've heard of that expression before. All right, then we have the evolutionary approach. This goes into the study of how natural selection has created us today, right? Because of natural selection, uh, somebody found traits that we have to be desirable, so they got passed on to future generations, right? How do we determine if those traits are desirable or not? Does it have to do with function? Does it have to do with how it looks? I went over the blue-eyed mutation with you in class, right? But thousands of years ago, somebody somewhere around Europe was born with blue eyes. And other people around that person found that trait attractive. They selected them as mates and they created other blue eyed babies. That is where we get blue eyed people now. Back from that one individual who had that one mutation that somebody out there found attractive and worth preserving and passing on to the next generation. Now, in class, I also gave that example of the red seal pup, that it was rejected by the mother, was rejected by its siblings. Why? Well, red will draw a lot of attention when you're surrounded by snow. Red will call a lot of attention when you're in the water. And if you're a seal, you don't want to get eaten, so you don't want to call attention to yourself. So this particular trait was found to be not attractive or desirable, so that seal pup was rejected. The mother did not care for it. The other seal pups rejected it as well. They did not play with it, did not interact with it. So that seal pup was doomed for a lonely death. And the key assumption in the evolutionary approach, guys, is that everything about us, how we adapt to the world, we can trace back to problems that early humans faced when they were adapting to their environments. And that is why we still behave that way today. Evolution is really slow, guys. So if you expect men to behave a different way, women to behave a different way, it's not going to happen overnight. It's like in us, it's inborn in us. It's going to take a while for evolution to take some of our urges away from us. Then we have the humanistic approach. The humanistic approach is all about us becoming the best versions of ourselves that we could possibly be. But in order to do that, we need to feel loved and we need to feel accepted, right? And then once we feel loved and accepted, then and only then can we work toward self actualization. What is self actualization? That is basically when we become the best version of ourselves that we could possibly be, right? So they wanted people to focus their consciousness into their ultimate goal. I want to be a brain surgeon. So what do you need to do? You need to work your way until you can actually become a brain surgeon, right? We need to be aware of ourselves and how we think of ourselves, because some people aren't very self-aware and don't have very good self-concept. They think they're good people when they're actually bad people, and we have some good people that think they're bad people, right? So these people obviously need to go see a psychologist that use the humanistic approach to help them self-actualize and become the best versions of themselves, right? uh, and here we want to assume that we have direct control of what we do, but our behavior, why do we behave this way? It's because of something that happened to us, right? So behavior is caused by what happened to us, but we are still in control of our own destiny, right? That's the humanistic approach. The psychodynamic approach was developed by one Sigmund Freud. And Freud really wanted to study our subconscious mind and the subconscious forces of our mind, right? And he believed that our childhood experiences have a great big effect on the type of people we grew up to become. So, how did he practice the psychodynamic or psychoanalytic approach? It's the same thing, right? Well, he used free association, right? I say something like fluffy. And if you say cloud, right? Okay. But if I say fluffy, and then you say something that's kind of odd, like a fluffy kangaroo, well, that's something we may need to talk about, right? Uh, Dream analysis and psychoanalysis as well. And we'll talk more about those two things in other units. And he also believed, and we are, that we are also born with instincts. Instincts are not reserved for lesser animals. We are born with instincts as well. We could also use the socio-cultural approach, which uses our culture and the society around us and their effect on us and our personality to explain why we are the way we are as well. Obviously, different cultures have different traditions, different values. Uh, so we are going to feel better with people from our own culture because we identify more readily with them. But our society is multicultural, so we have to learn how to interact with people from other cultures as well. So this approach uh, focuses on how our ethnicity, our gender, our culture, and yes, even our socioeconomic status, how all these things affect us and our mental processes. Uh, what does socioeconomic status have to do with this? Well, let me talk about that now, right? So, if your parents are well off, you've never gone hungry a day in your life, you've never not felt safe a day in your life, well, you don't have to worry about feeling safe. You don't know, you don't have to worry about your next meal. So you can actually start preparing for your future and trying to self actualize. People who grew up in ghettos or barrios, violent places, maybe they see their friends dying. They hear gunshots all over the place when they're trying to sleep at night. Do you think they're worried about the next test coming up, or are they thinking about surviving the night? Are they thinking about what am I going to eat tomorrow? And if that's what you're thinking about, can you really think about your future? Can you really think about becoming a brain surgeon? It's going to be awfully hard, right? So, socioeconomic status also has an effect on us. If it has a really bad effect on us, if we let it have that kind of effect on us as well. These is just a list of some of the doctors and some of their contributions to psychology. Now, if I were you, I'd look at this because we're going to study about a little bit more than half of the psychologists that you see on this little table. Uh, then we have applied psychology versus research psychology. What is this? Well, if you become a psychologist, you can either become a research psychologist or work in applied psychology, right? So, research psychologists, they go into labs and they experiment, they study things, and they publish papers which are read and then used by applied psychologists, right? But we'll talk about that right now. So, a research based biological psychologist might spend their time in the lab studying the brain and its activity and how that helps form uh, the people that we're working with today, right? A developmental psychologist will study people and how their abilities and how their bodies change from womb to tomb, from birth to death, guys. Developmental psychologists will study you from beginning to end. Of course, they're just studying you. They're not really going to help you. That's for an applied psychologist to do, right? Then we have cognitive psychologists. What do? They study on how we think, how we perceive the world, how do we solve problems, right? Do we have mental barriers that prevent us from seeing obvious solutions, right? This is what they're trying to study. Personality psychologists will investigate your persistent traits and how why did you get them. Do your parents have the same traits, and if they do, how do they manifest with them? The social psychologist will study how we view the world and how the world affects us. Now, if you want to be help people, right? You actually want to help people. You just don't want to study psychology. You don't want to just study people. You want to help them. You might want to get into applied psychologists, right? A clinical psychologist, think of this person as a therapist, right? They're going to treat you. They're going to try to find out what's wrong with you, and they will try to diagnose whatever disorder it is that you have to try to help you with that problem. A counselor, they're going to try to help you cope with stress, cope with, try to come up with different strategies that you can use to help you in your academic life, to help you in your work life, and even in your love life, right? You have marriage counselors that try to help people work on their marriage so they'll stay married and have a healthy marriage. Or they might just be interested in helping students and helping them deal with their stress and changing their study techniques to help them become better students, right? You might become an educational psychologist. What do? Well, they study and they help individuals in school and in the educational settings. What does that mean? They're going to help students out, but they're not just going to help students out. They're going to help teachers out. How do they help teachers out? Well, they might help us design our classroom to make it more conducive to learning. They'll even work with principals on how they can create an environment that will help learning become more fun, more enjoyable. Then you have your industrial slash organizational psychologist. You'll see these people in your workplace. And what are they doing? Well, they might be studying your workplace to make it more efficient. And by moving things around and making it more efficient, it helps you on the job as well, right? They study people and how they work with other people, and maybe they find better jobs for them in that particular organization so they can contribute to that organization more meaningfully. And there are different psychological associations all over the world that you can join once you become a psychologist. Now, I'm not a psychologist, but I do belong to TOPS, which is the Teachers of Psychologies in Secondary Schools. What does that mean? It means the American Psychological Association sends me information to help me teach the class. They'll send me materials that'll help me teach the class, right? There's a bunch of these psychological associations are willing to work with people to help them improve uh, their education or help people find the right therapist. If you guys have any questions, make sure you write them down and ask me in class. Thank you.